Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Runners Roundtable. Season 3 is all about the how-tos, and today's how-to episode is going to be about yoga and running. And so you all know where we are in time. It's actually such a perfect day for us to be having this discussion because it is June 21st, International Yoga Day, a day of celebration for this wonderful practice. And I am joined by Nicole Castillo, yoga teacher, run coach, and all around incredible human being. Nicole, you were here in season 2 when I was having the conversations with coaches. But as a reminder to everyone, if they haven't listened to that episode or this is the first time that they're going to hear your voice, tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are with running right now.
Okay. Hi. Thanks, Stephanie. And thanks again so much for having me back on. I was like, oh, when I saw the invitation, I was like, oh, this is going to be cool. I love chatting with you the first time. My name's Nicole and I live in Southern California. And here comes one of my cats again, because last time I think Morris made an appearance. We'll see if that happens again. I live in Southern California. I'm a runner. I've been running for 10 plus years now, but I did find it in my adulthood. I'm a run coach and I'm a yoga instructor as well, as you had mentioned.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
go ahead.
and then you asked, I'm sorry, I was like, what else did she ask me? Yeah, where I'm at in my running right now. So right now, I've been in this, I think last time when I spoke with you, I was kind of like in this weird shift that I knew that was happening. And I was kind of exploring, where I was at the time. And now I feel like I'm in a really good place where I am. And I just, I realized I kind of needed to back away a bit from the longer distances. And I think that was really hard for me to do, just because I was doing it for quite a while. And, when Saturdays came, that meant long run days. And I still have my Saturday long runs, but they just look a little bit different now. My mileage has been cut back down significantly. I've increased intensity. So I'm doing a lot more of the speed work, more of like a 5K focus. I'm not necessarily meaning that I'm going to be racing 5Ks or 10Ks, but that's kind of where my training is right now. So.
Yeah, and I think it's so funny because I was reflecting the other day how I feel like I'm in a season of marathoning once again. And it is so interesting to see how it can kind of go back and forth. For the longest time, I was not interested in marathons, or I would run them and then finish and say, never again. I don't ever want to do that again. And then I would sign up for one, like a year or two later. And this morning or whenever it was, because at this point for me, with everything that's happening in my life, time feels really funky. Like I don't know where I am in time.
Yeah.
But I thought of, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, here we go. I just finished running a marathon in April, and I have another marathon on the schedule for October. Like that hasn't happened in a really long time where I have 2 marathons in 1 year. So it is so interesting to see how we can shift and change. And even with those changes in distance focus, we're still runners, right? We're still doing this thing called running. And it is still very much a part of our identities. I had a question to kind of kick us off into this yoga running discussion. What came first for you, yoga or running?
The running did.
The running did. And then how did you get into yoga?
Yeah, so yoga has always just kind of been there, in the background, like, something that you like hear about, people do it. You kind of just know it from what you see, just on commercials or just, advertisements or what and so I started basically just doing it at home online, or just, doing like pigeon pose or something, from what I would see. And then I started going to yoga studios, and something clicked when I started going to the yoga studios. And I kind of just was in and out of the yoga scene for a bit. And it wasn't until I was kind of like, okay, I wanted to really start focusing more on the practice. And I just happened to find the studio that just really fit me perfectly. And that's when I decided I wanted to do the yoga teacher training. And it just all kind of took off from there. Like, and that was specifically a power yoga studio, which I know we're probably going to get into the different types of yoga in a bit and stuff. But that practice really just hit home for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to get into that because I'm always curious when I talk to yoga practitioners from other places, and even for myself, one of the things I love doing the most when I travel is taking a yoga class, because I'm always so curious as to how different places define what yoga is, because a power yoga class in Miami is way different than a power yoga class that I took in Sedona. Like,
Yeah.
worlds apart in difference. So I'm always curious about that. But before we get to that, how would you define what yoga is?
Oh, that's such a loaded question, right?
I guess we'll kind of keep it limited to as a movement modality, right? Because I feel like you've got your yoga philosophy and then you've got the physical yoga practice. And I know for myself, and I don't know if it was similar to you, what came first for me was the movement practice. And it was after finding a home in that practice that I started to get curious about the philosophy. So let's, for the sake of simplicity in this discussion, we can put the philosophy piece aside. However, if anyone wants to talk philosophy and all the more mental aspects of yoga, reach out to us. Reach out to us, because I'm sure you and I can get into some heavy discussions on it. But yeah, so in your opinion, yoga as a physical movement practice, how would you describe it to people, or how would you define it?
That's still also a loaded question, right? Because I feel that yoga is just, it's one of those things. It kind of goes back to that whole idea of like, if you run, you're a runner, right? You don't have to fit a certain box. And I feel that yoga is such the same way, in that it's really your own practice. So I do feel that there are, movements on the mat. I mean, okay, so when you think of yoga, you're on a yoga mat doing specific poses or sequences, and you're connecting breath to movement in some of the yoga styles. Other yoga styles, you're, in a pose and you're doing breath with the movement. So it's just completely, and I think it just goes back to the different styles of yoga that there are too, right? Because every different yoga you're doing, there's something different. There's a specificity to each different type of yoga. So I think, if you talk about specifically like a vinyasa yoga, you're connecting your movement to your breath in a sequence that flows in this fluid form. I'm not too sure if I'm really answering your question.
Well, I think it's, so for me, I think it is kind of a difficult question, because there are so many preconceived notions as to what yoga is, right? I have a lot of people, as a teacher, I would have a lot of people that I would invite them to my classes or any events that I'm putting on. And I would always get I'll go when I'm more flexible. Like, the flexibility factor is something that prevents people from coming to yoga. And I'm like, wait, why do we even think that you have to be flexible to do this? Similar to running, where it's, oh, I can't run with you because I run a 13-minute mile, right? Where it's like, just show up. So I think yoga is just, and it's funny because right now, I love that we're having this conversation right now, because I'm actually, again, like in a season of life where I'm doing more marathons, and I've recognized this about myself, that when I'm running more, I get on my mat less. I practice less, even though I know it would be really beneficial for me, but I don't practice as much because the classes that I would go to, I don't feel they necessarily benefit me as a runner. So can you kind of give us a rundown in terms of, at least for you, where you live, what are the different types of classes, the styles of classes that are offered in either your studio or in your area, so that people can maybe, if they hear these words wherever they're at, they can start to connect the dots?
Right. So, you know, I think just really quick before we go into that, I think going back to just when you started talking, it sparked something. So I think it really is for yoga, for me, is basically, if you have a body, you can do yoga. That's pretty much where I was like, okay, it's getting there, right? So yeah, if you have a body, you can do yoga. It may not necessarily look like what you think it would look like, but it's still yoga. So I think that's a very important point to make. And I know we'll probably get into misconceptions about yoga and stuff, but I think that's a big one. Yeah.
I love that. I love that so much, because again, I either hear, one, I'm not flexible, or two, the second most popular excuse I hear, or justification I hear for not coming to a yoga class, is that it's boring and that all you do is meditate. And when people tell me that, I'm like, you need to come to my class, because that's not what we do. Yes, it's a part of the class, but there's so much else that happens. So those are the top two reasons that I get from people. Either they're not flexible or it's boring, because they don't know how to meditate and they don't want to sit in quiet and all that stuff. But
100%.
yeah. So
I was just going to say, it's funny because that was like one of my hangups, was like, it was too slow. It was too boring, you know, and because, you know, as running, it's fast paced. We like to challenge ourselves. We do it because it's hard sometimes, you know what I mean? All of those things, like we push our bodies, we push our minds. It's all of these things that as runners we do. And when we think of yoga, it's like, oh, it's slow, it's boring, you know, it has that meditation movement. And you know what I mean? The music, like, it's just exactly. So I get that can also be a misconception. And again, come to one of my yoga classes, or one of the classes that are offered at my studio or any of the other studios, and you're sweating, like you are getting a workout in, along with everything else that comes with yoga.
Yeah, I think I was very fortunate in the first class I ever took. So running is what came first for me. And it wasn't even, I mean, I started running in August of 2012. And then I think I took my first yoga class in March of 2013. So it's really like not that big of a gap. And similarly, I had heard about yoga. I mean, in college, I worked at a gym, so I knew there were yoga classes. But for some reason, I just didn't think it was for me. Like, I was like, that's not my space. Like, and I would stretch. I remember I would pull out a little mat and I'd do some stretching. But for some reason, I didn't think that the stretching I was doing was yoga. I just thought it was me just stretching. And I got injured, didn't run for 6 weeks, and I needed something to do. At that point, I was hooked on movement and I needed some kind of movement practice. And I found a Groupon deal to a local yoga studio, and that is what I bought. I bought it. I bought the Groupon, and I reasoned with myself, I just need to go to 3 classes. If I go to 3 classes, that's the equivalent of the drop-in fee for a single class. So if I can just make myself go to 3 classes, then I'll feel like I got my money's worth from this Groupon. That first class that I went to, it was a power yoga class at 8:30 p.m. at night, because it was after my kids went to bed, like totally different scene. I went, Had no clue what was happening, but it was fast. I was sweating at the end of it. And it really, to me, it felt so like running, because when I finished, I just remember thinking, what the hell happened? And okay, but I survived it. Like, it was kind of that feeling, which I still feel that way on a lot of my runs, where I'm like, what just happened there? How did I do that? But okay, I did it. Like, it's
Yeah.
cool. So I
Yeah.
think that for me, that first class and then the subsequent classes that I took, they were all these power yoga classes, because those classes were so fast paced, set to music. I mean, you are moving quickly. It's a heated room. I was sweating. So it was very much so like, yes, stretching my body, but there was also this kind of cardio component to it. So that when I finished, it really did give me that similar sensation to running. And honestly, I thought that's what all yoga classes were like after that. And it wasn't until we moved away, we spent a year in Chicago, and it wasn't until that year in Chicago that I discovered that there were different types of yoga, and that there were different ways to engage in the practice. And that's when everything shifted for me as a yoga practitioner, where I was like, oh, I don't have to sweat all the time. Like, and it's not to say that that's not good, but it was just a different way of connecting to my body that didn't involve it being like all in max effort, sweating and like, no.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so that's, again, I got into it because of a class that really reminded me of running. But what has kept me connected to the practice is very much so the elements that are opposite to that feeling. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Definitely makes sense.
different styles of yoga that you can walk us through, at least in your studio or just in general, that you are aware of, and then I can chime in with like, hey, in Miami it kind of looks like this.
Yeah. Okay. So at the specific studio that I'm at, it so it's not strictly a power yoga studio, but it was at one point. Um, but now that there's yin classes also offered. And a yin class is more primarily down on your mat. It's more of that stretching that you think of. Um, it's also, you can use props in it, such as blocks, such as straps, um, to kind of deepen into the stretch. And it is with the breathing as well, also, because I feel like with every yoga, breath is also very important. But you're doing just specific poses mostly, and it's less intense. I mean, you can make it very intense if you're overly stretching, right? Which is, I think, something that also might be a misconception, is that, just like with running, and I think with anything else in life, you can take it just a little bit, you can either not get uncomfortable and you can stay very easy with it, or you can overly do it and like maybe take it too far. Because yes, you can get injured in yoga as well. If you overly stretch a muscle or something, or you're not warmed up enough, or you're just like not right quite there. So it's really finding the intention behind the stretching that you're doing, or the intention behind the movement. Power yoga, which is more of the vinyasa flow at a faster pace. So with vinyasa, like I had mentioned before, it's sequences that are more fluidly done throughout the mat, connecting the breath with the movement, and very fluid, maybe sometimes not so fluid transitions, just depending on how creative we're trying to get in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think with vinyasa flowing, there is a lot of creativity that can happen of just creating the different types of sequencing that is going down on the mat. Hatha, I know, is also very, well-known yoga practice. And in Hatha, it's pretty similar to the vinyasa, except the thing is that there's not necessarily a sequence or a transition going on. It's strictly more you're in a pose, you're holding the pose, you're breathing through the pose, and then it's okay, let's go on to a different pose, as opposed to a clear fluid transition. Usually, typically, Hatha would probably be good for if you're like, I mean, it's good for everyone, but if you're a beginner and you're kind of getting just, accustomed to the different poses and what poses are, that'd probably be a good one to try out. It might not be as fast paced as the power yoga though, but yeah. Trying to think of some other ones. Hot yoga, I know, is a very popular one as well, and that one has the same 26 poses. In hot yoga, the room is really hot, like 100 degrees, 90 to 100 degrees. That one I know is also very popular in the area that I'm at. Is that popular over there in Florida?
I feel like at least, so now I'm Miami is my home base, so East Coast, but right now we're on the West Coast. And I would say no. I mean, there are the places for it. There are hot yoga studios.
Yeah.
I know there are, but I feel like maybe 5 to 7 years ago, they were more popular. Whereas now I feel like we're seeing more of that vinyasa style class kind of take over.
Yeah.
And I will say that in particular in Miami, it is very much so a power yoga, power vinyasa city. Like there have been so many new studios open up, and there's a lot happening in the yoga community, and it's really exciting, but it is very much so power based. A lot of power yoga, a lot of like very athletic practices. I'll put it that way, athletic. I'm curious, are the power yoga classes for you, are those always heated classes or no?
It depends on the instructor and like the students and what they're kind of comfortable with. During the winter time, they are heated. But we're talking about, as in heated, it's about anywhere between 70 to 85 degrees or so.
Yeah.
So not overly heated like you would think in a hot yoga studio.
So I think here in Miami, or I'll stay mostly talking about Miami because that's what I know the most of. Power yoga classes there are always heated, and what's really popular right now are the infrared heating systems. So it's hot, and I feel like we kind of straddle this line of how hot can you make it. It's not necessarily it's not necessarily as hot as hot yoga, because I think hot yoga, it's supposed to be like 103 or something like that. I forget what the number is for them. So it's not necessarily that hot, but it's definitely hot enough where you are going to sweat. I want to go back to something you just said, because I feel like I just want to dive a little bit deeper into that, because I feel like it is a big misconception that you cannot get injured while practicing yoga. And I want to talk about how that in particular is something that runners should be aware of. And I'll share for myself that, I had back in the day, if anyone ever wants to go down the rabbit hole of my Instagram account, I would do so many different yoga challenges, like so many different yoga challenges. And I injured my hamstring because I got into compass pose. So compass pose is just, you're lifting your leg, it's nonsense. Honestly, it's just nonsense. But I didn't stretch. And it was literally because I wanted to get the picture so that I could post it on Instagram for this challenge. Okay.
Yeah.
Listen to the previous episode on social media. This is a story of it. Again, I'm not immune to this stuff. I'm not immune to social media. But I remember doing the pose, getting the picture, and even while I was doing the pose, thinking, oh, something did not feel too great there.
Yeah.
And I just, that was definitely, it wasn't an injury that prevented me from running or from doing yoga, but it was definitely something that whatever flexibility I had, I lost because I stretched that muscle too much when it wasn't ready. So
Yeah.
when it comes to running, I guess what are some of the muscles that we should be targeting as runners if we're going to a yoga class? Because I think even that the muscles that we target are also the muscles we need to be careful not to overstretch or to injure.
Yeah. Well, I think going back to your hamstring thing, I think that's one thing that runners should be very concerned about when they go to a yoga class, because that can happen very easily, right? Not just in like, a crazy pose like compass pose, but if you're doing like pyramid, something where I think probably not every studio, but it's a very common pose. And that's, where you're standing with your legs are like hip width apart, and you're bending, you can bend it. Usually you bend into the pose, right? So you are stretching that hamstring. And I feel like if you're overly stretching it to the point of what you're not necessarily discomfort in the sense of like more of discomfort, like, oh, this hurts, right? Because we don't want something to hurt. And I think that's where we have to really remind ourselves, like, I think as runners, we like to push ourselves and we like to see how far can we take this pose. And I think even though we're not supposed to be competing when we're on our yoga mats, sometimes it's hard to turn that switch off sometimes, right? Even if it's not you're competing with someone next to you, you're competing with yourself, right? Like, how far can I get into this pose? And if you take it too far, exactly like you said, like you're not warmed up enough, or maybe you are just not that flexible to get into that like take it that far, or your body just is not made for that certain pose. Because I think that's also something else too that's very important, is that I don't care how flexible you are or how long you've been doing yoga, right? There may be specific poses that your body just cannot get into very easily, right? That somebody else can. And maybe that other person won't be able to get into that other pose like you can, right? So I feel like our bodies, just the proportions of our bodies to make a huge difference, right? Like some of us have longer arms, some of us have longer legs, and all of that plays a role into exactly like what a pose will look like or feel like on us, right? So I think as runners, yes, we should not be overly stretching. So yeah, watch out for your hamstrings. I think our hamstrings is a huge one for with yoga. Even like the forward fold, which is a very common place to go, like your forward folds, your downward dogs, like bend your knees. It's okay to have those micro bends in your knees. You don't need to look like a flat pancake when you're forward folding, So that's not the point. That's
I'm sorry. Yeah,
yeah. It's not the point of the pose. The point of the pose is not for you to see how straight you can get your legs, right? The point of the pose is not to do that. So bend your knees if you need to bend your knees, and let's not get injured.
Yeah, that's the thing that I always, so for here in Miami, I'll say I'll just share what we have. So we power yoga classes, which I've spoken about. They're usually heated. Here, they're very fast paced. I mean, incredibly fast paced. And I snap because I'm snapping now because that's what I want you to know. That's the pace that you're moving at. Like when you're moving through sun salutations, which in my classes, whenever I'm teaching a power class, I usually tell people, I just need you to survive the first 10 to 15 minutes. If you can get through the first 10 to 15 minutes, the rest is cruising. We're cruising, but we're going to move really fast. And it is up dog, down dog, look forward, travel, lengthen, fold, rise, dive. Like though, like I have for me, perfected the language of moving people quickly through the sun salutations. And it's that it is a single word: rise, dive, shoot it back, or whatever the case is, just very quick stuff. And that's with a power class.
Right.
We do have, you'll see studios that will offer vinyasa flow classes. And in my opinion, your vinyasa flow class is like a power class, but not heated and slowed down just a little bit. Then there's yin classes, like you mentioned. The yin classes are more of that static stretching, and static stretching where the poses are held for like 3 to 5 minutes. So there's not a lot of movement. And I do find that it is very much a mat heavy class in terms of you're going to be low to the ground most of the time. Whereas with your power class or vinyasa class, you're going to be doing stuff where your arms are up. You're going to be balancing on one leg. You are going to work through those transitions. And that's another thing I always tell my students in those classes, where I'm like, oh, there's stick figures in my brain and it looks really nice in my brain. But once I see real life humans doing it, I realize, okay, we can't do it that way, or it has to change, or this transition looks really cool up here, but the communication and the execution of it doesn't really work out quite as well. And I think that's something as a teacher, I have to constantly remind myself that, hey, simple is good. Like keeping it simple is challenging as well. Slowing it down is challenging as well. So we have power, we have vinyasa flow, we have yin. Some studios down here offer restorative. I don't know if you have restorative, but I learned this in the pandemic. Restorative is not what I thought it was. So in Miami, restorative is you're still kind of moving quite a bit and you're still flowing. And it wasn't until the pandemic that I started taking online classes with different teachers that I learned that some people teach restorative as a practice of maybe 1 to 2 poses. And that's it. 1 to 2 poses that are fully supported. Lots of props. Like you are cocooning your body, and it's all about relaxing the nervous system, relaxing everything. It blew me away. I had no clue. I remember being in a group and people were talking about restorative yoga. And at one point I raised my hand and I'm like, are we talking about the same thing? Because my experience with that word is totally different. So for people who are listening, just a reminder that even though Nicole and I are talking about practices that are similar, it might be different wherever you are. In Miami as well, certain studios will have a yoga for athletes like class. Do you have any of that where you're at?
I haven't found any that were like that. I haven't even like really heard of any offered like that, other than the fact of if it's like a run club offering like some yoga at the end of a run or some, but other than that, at a studio, like maybe I should start.
That's something that we have here. But again, in Miami, power yoga is a thing that people want to do. So I find that those other styles of yoga, it takes a little more convincing because people, and it's no shade to the practice, no shade to how it's been taught. That's a totally different conversation that we won't get into here right now. But a lot of people do approach yoga as a workout. And if they're not sweating and if they're not like out of breath, leaving, feeling like they got their butts handed to them, then to them, it's not, that yoga class wasn't worth it, right? I don't know if you've experienced that as well with people.
I've had people not tell me like during class or anything, but I've, in conversation, that they've said it's either or, right? It's either too much or it's not enough. It's the thing of like, exactly going back to like, it's too slow and they want to work out.
Yeah.
That's what they want, is a workout.
It's really complicated. It's like unnecessarily complicated, but that's part of this discussion, right? Where it's like there isn't even a universal definition for what yoga as a movement practice is, because it can be so different depending on where you're at. I'm going to kind of go backwards right now because we got into the injury piece without really getting into why yoga is beneficial for runners to begin with.
Right. So I think it's beneficial for a few reasons. And I'm just going to kind of go off, not list them, but I guess list them. So I think one of them, I'm like, how should I do this? So I think one of them is the breath work. I think that's important. I think, as runners, we do breathe a lot. And that's, when we're running, and sometimes we're like running really hard, and, and if we're not breathing, like, so I've had this happen to me before. I don't know if anybody else has, but like sometimes if I'm running really hard and your brain will start to think like, oh no, like we're working way too hard here. And then that's when your brain is telling your body to shut down. And then that's when your mind has to kind of say, no, let's just keep pushing through this. So I think breath work in the yoga practice can really help with that as well. Just being very in tune and knowing your breath. I feel like we go around this world and life and everything without even thinking about our breath. It's something that we automatically do 24/7, and we don't ever really acknowledge it. And I think that that's a really, unfortunate thing. And I think, breathing and learning to like breathe and move with it as one is something that runners can really, learn to appreciate within their own running. I also think the whole aspect of the mind, going into, and I won't go too far into this, but going into the meditation, going into, like you said, some of the restorative practices, calming down the nervous system, doing all of that, because I feel like too, a lot of the times as runners, we don't do that enough. There's a lot of, and I think it really can help too, if you're struggling a lot too, with just going back to runners not running easy runs easy enough. And a lot of that having to do with our egos, and a lot of that having to do with comparing ourselves to other runners and all of that. And I think with yoga, allowing yourself to quiet the mind down, to really dive deeper and going inward more and detaching from the ego and, going through that whole process, I think really can, enlighten a lot of runners. And they'll like, I think it just really changes someone. And I think it can really change it into the way that you go about your running. Going into the physical aspect, I feel like with yoga, you can strengthen your body, right? I don't think it's a substitution for strength training and lifting heavy, but I think it's a way to strengthen your body. I think it's a way to move your body that's not just forward with the forward motion. Although I think maybe with trail runners, right? With trail runners, you are moving around a little bit more, right? Side to side, dodging things and stuff. But I think with yoga, you're opening up yourself to a whole different plane that your body normally doesn't do. Even just in our normal everyday lives, when we walk, when we are sitting, when we're driving, even though we're not doing it, we're going forward. So with yoga, you're really allowing your body to open up to different angles that it normally doesn't do, even with just, I think it's maybe runners don't think of this as much, but even with the upper body, when we're tired, when you're at the end of a marathon or a half marathon, or if it's your first 5K or you're just starting out, when we're tired, our form starts to kind of go away. Yes. And we do this like slouching, our shoulders start to come in. And with yoga, it's a lot of opening up through the shoulders, opening up through the heart, opening up that whole space and lengthening through the spine and your back and everything. So all of that, I think if you're constantly doing that as a practice in yoga, it's going to translate over into running, because you're going to have that. It's not muscle memory. Well, it is muscle memory. So it's not specifically your muscles, right? I don't want people to think like, oh, your muscles, but it's your memory of lengthening and, opening up, right? Which also, if you think about it too, you're not collapsing within your lungs, especially if you're an ultra runner or you're climbing up those hills and those mountains, and if you're bringing your shoulders inward, it's a little bit harder to breathe, right? Too. So it's just about opening up that space a lot. Hips, right? We always hear runners, we have our tight hips, right?
Yep.
We're running, we're going one way, our legs are doing one thing for a very long time, and then we go and we sit, right? So with yoga, it allows you to open up that space too, which doesn't leave us as stiff, right? So with yoga, I think you get both the stretching, even though we don't want to overstretch, right? But we also get the mobility. So we are working our joints. We are also, with yoga, I feel like, and it's not just with the running too, but just doing everyday natural things in life. If you're like on the floor playing with, a child or an infant, or you're doing something on the floor and you need to get up, it's the way of getting right. So like,
Yeah.
sometimes if you have like that yoga practice in you, your joints are just going to be able to move in specific ways more easily than if you didn't. And let's see, balancing. So in yoga, there is a lot of balancing. Running, we typically don't think of it as a one-legged sport, right? Or an activity, but it is. When you are running, you are landing on one foot, you are picking that foot up, and you're putting the other one down. So it is a one foot activity that you're doing, right? So when in yoga, you're doing the balancing, you're practicing the balancing. Sure, you may fall over when you're doing tree pose, and that's completely and 100% fine. And maybe you don't even get your whole leg up in tree pose, and that's 100% fine. But you are learning to ground that foot down. You are learning to balance. You are learning to lengthen through. And that all translates over into the running. I don't know if you want to jump in or if there's anything else that you can think of, or I don't know if.
Yeah, I love everything you've said, because especially when it comes to, I feel like for me, the breath has been one of the biggest things. And it's something I always say, and I live by it, that if I can breathe deeply, breathe calmly, my breath is going to send a message to my mind that I'm okay. And then my mind is going to send the signal to my body that my body is okay. So the breath is so incredibly important, because yeah, when we're doing that speed work, when we're running, I mean, I have runs. Honestly, the past few runs I've had, it's the first half mile. I'm like, this is so hard. Why am I doing it? I mean, it's hot, it's humid, it's rough here. But once I start to control my breath, then I find the rhythm within my body more easily. Our breath is so incredibly powerful in defining what our experience is, because if you're breathing, that just creates anxiety. That's going to create anxiety in the body. Your brain is going to start thinking something's up. So I love that you started off with the breath, because that is something that is so incredibly important. And even just hearing yourself breathe, right? Like that's something for me. I don't run with headphones anymore. I haven't ran with headphones since 2019 at this point. And it was so informative for me, because I got to hear my breathing, and I also got to hear how my feet were landing and all that stuff. It gives you so much information, where for me, it started to become a question of, how can I breathe a little bit easier? How can I lengthen my inhales, lengthen my exhales, so that I'm not breathing shortly? How can I breathe in a way that is engaging my diaphragm, so then I am bringing in more oxygen? And as runners, we want all the oxygen because then the oxygen goes to our red blood cells and then we're happier as runners. So I really do love that you started with that. And also I just love that you mentioned that running is a single foot, single leg activity, because we don't think about it. We just think that both of our legs are going, when it's no, you're jumping from foot to foot to foot to foot. And that's something in my yoga classes, we do a lot of balance work. And forget it, the minute I know that there's a runner in my class, we do even more. And whenever I've had classes where the class will end and I'll go up to that person, I'll be like, I'm sorry, you told me you were a runner. You shouldn't have done that. That's why we did all this balance work, because runners need so much help with balance. And I think all that you're saying really comes down to just like this awareness of your body, this awareness of the experience of being in your body while you're doing the movement of running. And again, I just appreciate it because I find that there's so many parallels between yoga and running and yoga, and then all of that with life. Of if you can breathe through the hard moments, you can make it through the hard moments. And that's something I learned in yoga, which then went into my running, which then cycles back into yoga whenever it's a class that feels particularly hard or challenging. So I love that you bring that up. Now, if we have a runner and they come to you and they're like, Coach, I'd like to incorporate yoga into my training schedule, how should this person approach adding yoga into their movement, workout, training routine?
Yeah, so if they are not practicing yoga and they haven't really practiced yoga and they're completely kind of brand new to it, I would say I would actually advise anyone. I think it's kind of harder when you're an instructor, but if you're not an instructor, right, I think doing it about 2 or 3 times a week is pretty good. Even if you're like barely starting out, probably twice a week would be a good place to start doing it. And I would also advise them to take different yoga classes to see what they like. And once they figured out kind of what they like, I can definitely guide them into saying, hey, you might like this, and this is the days you should probably do it on. So if they do like that power yoga, the vinyasa flows and stuff, probably maybe stick that on like one of your harder days, right? So that you're, kind of getting in the hard stuff on the same days. If that doesn't work out, that's totally fine. Maybe because there are some days, even for me, there are days when I'm like, I really want to go to yoga class because I'm just like, I need to go to yoga class, right? But I'm like, my body is kind of like, I don't want to like do this today. Then you know what? It's okay to like back off a bit. I always say like, it's very, just like in running, it's so important to listen to where your body's at on that specific day. So it's okay. So maybe you're not going to hold your side plank, right, for as long as everyone else. Maybe you're going to modify and drop down that knee, right? So, and that's completely and 100% okay. You're still getting benefits from it. I would also probably suggest yin or restorative yoga if they want to take more of doing it on like maybe their day off, like if they have like a rest day or something, then maybe doing a yin or restorative class would be a good place to fit those types of yoga into their practice.
So do you consider yoga to be cross training? Is that something that I feel like that's a loaded question.
It is. And I've actually had to I don't even think I have an answer for that right now, because I like go back and forth with that, right? It's funny because I don't know, me personally, I use the VDOT platform for my athletes, and so when I'm working on their schedules and I'm putting a cross training day in, and they have yoga as an option for cross training, right? So I'm like, okay, well, they think it's cross training, right? I don't know. Sometimes I do think it's it, and sometimes I don't. It's a very hard, right? Because we're not necessarily even, and that I think that even goes for strength training too, right? Is that really cross training? Because I think that's totally, I would say spin bike is cross training, riding your bike is cross training, rollerblading is cross training, on the rowing machine is cross training. I feel like anything where you're aerobically using your heart and your lungs and all that when you're moving at like a faster pace and your heart is getting a higher heart rate. Not to say that that's not going to happen in a yoga class. I think that is specifically cross training, right? So I think it does depend. I don't know. I don't have a straightforward answer for that. Do you have any ideas, or what is your take on it?
Yeah, so I feel like it's not cross training for the reasons that you just stated, in terms of cross training is something that's going to work the aerobic system, that's going to
Right.
work what you need as a runner. Not to say that yoga is not something you need as a runner, but in terms of like building that aerobic engine, working the legs in a different way, that just working the body in a similar aerobic capacity, but without the intensity on the joints.
Right.
And I think also just strength training is strength training. It's not cross training. To me, strength training is its own beautiful little thing. So yoga is one of those things that I don't know how to define it. I feel like yoga is like
Right.
strength training, and that it would be its very own thing as well. So I have some difficulty with even understanding, or and it's so person dependent. It is so person dependent, athlete dependent, in terms of where to put the yoga when it comes to their training. And I say this even just, full disclosure, even for myself, where I would just do yoga whatever it fit in my schedule. It had nothing to do with what runs I had. And if it made sense, it was just, oh, here's a class that fits on this day because I have the time available and I'm going to go take it. So I really appreciate your encouragement of take different classes with different teachers. Like, go explore what you like, and then the one that you like, that's the one to try to stick to, because I do find that yoga is a practice where you have to like it, you have to like the teacher, you have to like the studio, you have to like what you're doing in
Yeah.
order to keep on doing it. And as someone who, again, I like to go to different studios, and I know that each studio has its own culture and
Yeah.
there is a vibe. Each studio, the teachers, their playlists and how they create the class, even in something I've taken yin classes, right? Where one teacher will set it up a certain way, and then another teacher does it a completely different way, where one teacher might speak a little bit more in a yin class and another teacher doesn't speak at all. And then there's a playlist or there's not a playlist. So there's so much variety within it that
Yeah.
I I'm in that boat of it's not cross training, because while I find that it is incredibly beneficial for runners, I don't gosh, how what am I trying to say here without like discouraging people from trying yoga? Because I'm like, I feel like I'm saying it in a way that's not not very helpful to the cause.
No, 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 because I totally feel you. Like, yeah. So while I'm not like strictly like, no, it's not, I would definitely say it is. I completely 100% agree with you that it is its own thing. Just how I would not say that strength training is cross training, right? It is its own thing. And I think that there is space in that, right, for running, right? We don't have to strictly just do running or cross training, right? Because we know that strength training is so important for runners, right? So I think it's okay to just have that open space that yoga is its own thing, right? Because like we said, we didn't even get into the whole philosophies and all that other stuff as to why it's like makes it so great, right?
Yeah.
Besides just the asanas and the movement and everything. that it does have, it is that big. It is that big and important that it is its own thing that will benefit runners, right?
So say you have a runner and they tell you, I want to start incorporating yoga into my schedule. And you've said, okay, 2 to 3 times a week, kind of work it in where it fits. Does that suggestion of 2 to 3 times a week, does that change based on what that runner is training for or not? Like if you have someone who's training for a 5K versus someone who's training for a marathon, does it really matter in that case?
I think so. If they're just starting out, like, keep it at a minimum. But I think if, you've been going for a while and you know your body, you know the practice, you kind of know where you're at in training. So like you said, when you're marathon training, because this even goes for me too. If I am marathon training, I can keep up going to yoga class with also the teaching for a good while, right? But once I'm in like those peak weeks, forget it. I am not attending yoga classes, maybe like once a week. Plus, I'm still teaching, right? So I'm still getting about 3 yoga classes in. But if I'm teaching, it doesn't mean that I have to fully do the entire class too, right? You can take your breaks when you want to. So I think it does change depending on where you are at in your training. I think it does change with your lifestyle, right? So do you have a very high stressful job, right? Do you have little kids? Are your kids older? Can they take care of themselves now? So you don't have to expend all this energy watching like a 2-year-old. It just, not to say that teenagers aren't, energy. Doesn't take energy, but you know what I mean. It just depends on like how much time and energy do you have to dedicate to going to a yoga class, right? Maybe if you are further along in your yoga practice, or maybe even if you're not, maybe if you just do the sun salutation for 15 minutes or for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and you can get that in, maybe that's what it looks like. Maybe it's not a yoga class,
So that was going to be a question I had in terms of how much time should a person dedicate to a yoga practice? And that's something that I find myself in general at this point in my life. I'm really just trying to be more expansive with how I view everything. So yoga can be 10 minutes of me stretching on the floor, but breathing with intention, moving with intention, like being really present. That to me can be yoga, just as, sitting 10 minutes in meditation. That is yoga as well, because it is that let's bring the mind back into the body, back into this current moment. So how do we, or yeah, that's the question. It's how much time does a person really need to spend practicing yoga?
Right. So I don't know if I have like a 60 minutes a day type answer for you, because it is just goes along to exactly what you said. I think yoga, and I really do believe this as of right now. I don't know if my, if my mind will change later on down the line, but right now where I'm at within my yoga practice, yoga is one of those things that is every day, right? So that doesn't mean that I'm going to class every single day, but I am intentionally practicing a certain aspect of yoga every day, right? And goes back to what you just said. Maybe it is just stretching for 5 minutes down on the mat, but you're doing it with intention. And I think that's the whole point of what yoga is, right? It's your intention of bringing in the mind and the body and making it one, right? Doing it with a certain purpose. The meditation, right? And I don't even think we've mentioned this yet, but with meditation, right? And it isn't the physical aspect of it, but that's another way that runners I feel can really go into their visualization. I think that's a strong mind component for runners. I think it does clear a lot of things away as well. And I think it's also, we're not sleeping, but we are in a state of rest and stillness, which I think runners can really get something from, because it is recovery. It's another form of recovery, is meditation. And I'm really big believer in that as well.
Okay, so you plucked this question out of my mind because I will agree with you on the fact that I think the meditative aspects of it, I do think that's recovery, because it is, again, giving your brain the time to just decompress. And I hope you agree with the statement that I'm about to make, because I feel like a common misconception when it comes to meditation is that you're silencing the mind, or that the thoughts are supposed to stop. And again, I hope you agree with my statement here, where it's meditation is just you observing your thoughts. The thoughts are what they are. And there's this metaphor, I'm sure you've heard it, but I've heard it so many times, where it's like, oh, in meditation, it's imagine your mind's like the sky, and the thoughts are just the clouds floating by. They're going to come across, but you're going to let them go. They're just going to kind of go across. That's, again, a really big myth that people seem to, or just a thought that people have, that, oh, I can't meditate because I can't stop my thoughts. And it's like, yeah, that's the whole point. Like, we're not trying to stop the thoughts. We're just trying to become aware of them and become what I call the observer. We're just observing what's happening and letting that go. And that's why I'm like, wait, I agree so much with what you're saying in terms of that being a recovery tool, because so much of our lives are spent in go, 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 next, 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 no time to sit back and process and just simply be. But what are your thoughts on people using the physical practice of yoga as recovery? Is that recovery for you?
Not a vinyasa or power yoga class. No.
Okay.
No, it is not recovery.
Okay. Yeah.
There are times when I was, I'm in a yoga class and I'm like, whoa, that was an intense class. And the next day, guess what? I feel it in my run. So no, I don't think that's recovery at all. Maybe if I did a restorative yoga class, that might be a form of recovery, just depending on what poses happened in that class, right? Kind of like how far you pushed it. And same thing with yen. So I don't necessarily think yoga is recovery. No.
Okay. Yeah. No, I agree with you. That's why I'm like, wait a minute. I kind of want to ask this question, because for me, I don't consider it recovery, because you're still making your muscles work. For me, recovery is when you are letting your muscles rest. And that's something that I'll say here, that, if the choice is sleep an additional hour or go to that yoga class, if we're talking about recovery, I'm going to tell you sleep. Don't take the yoga class, go sleep, because there's so much that happens in sleep. And to your point, where I don't know if it's the same for you, but for me down here, I walk into a class and I don't necessarily know what I'm getting. So it's not like I'm saying, hey, it's a 45-minute easy run, right? No, I'm walking into a 45-minute power class and I have no clue what's going to happen in that class. And I find that I hear it too when people say, oh, I'll take the class, but I'll take it easy, or I'll hold back. And I'm like, no, if we have to put this, I'm going to take it easy or hold it back, that's not a recovery. You're not doing that as recovery. That is something else entirely. So I'm glad that you and I are on the same page.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Because it's, again, I've had people tell me that, oh, I'll take the class, but I'll take it easy. And at least for me, when it comes to people that I work with or runners that I know, when they ask me questions about yoga, it is very much so, okay, but just be honest with yourself in terms of how you feel. Because if you're taking this yoga class and then you're feeling the soreness on your run, that yoga class, like, what is that yoga class doing? Like, is it really offering you what you think you're getting? Because if you're going to a yoga class with the intention of stretching, but then the next day you can't laugh because your abs are so sore, then did we really get the stretching or did we get something else?
Right. Too many eagle crunches.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can have a lot of fun with that.
Yeah.
So if we could, for you, as we start to like bring this conversation together or bring it to our culmination point, if
Yes.
there was one piece of advice that you could give to a runner who is interested in incorporating yoga into their weeks, what would that be?
To really listen to your body and be honest with yourself. I think
Okay. I'm going to push you on this one. Okay.
that's me. Let's see.
Okay.
See
So
where this goes.
no, and I'm sure you've gotten this question before. How do I listen to my body? What does that mean?
That's a good question. So, like you said, if you're tired, right? Okay, so I think anything this goes to like with running as well, right? Especially for those early morning runners. And I just know this because I'm an early morning runner and I'm sure it happens for later, right? Yeah. When that alarm goes off, right? It's always a battle. I don't want to get out of bed. It's too early, right? I'm tired. I want to stay in bed. I want to keep sleeping, and it's always like, get up, no, get up, go, snoozing the alarm. It's that fine line, right? Which I think you kind of, when you start to really be in tune with the practice, with your running, with you as yourself, being honest with yourself. Is it that I really am tired and I really need that sleep? Or is it that I just don't want to get out of bed right now? Right? It's that like really fine line of like, what do I actually really need? And it's kind of hard to make that decision, right? When you're half asleep. So I
Yeah.
think when it comes to like having to take a yoga or going to yoga class, like, so there are days, and this is just for my own personal experience as well, where it's in the morning, right? I've done my run, I've done whatever I'm going to do, right? It's morning time, I'm feeling good, I'm not tired, I've got all this energy, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't wait for yoga class later tonight, when I get off work, and I have all these big plans, right? The day goes on, and I'm like, no, I'm feeling kind of tired, right? And then it kind of keeps going, and then I'm like, no, you know what? I need to go home. I need to just eat dinner earlier, and I just need to get into bed earlier, right? So when those days hit, and there are days that are like that, where I'm like, I am not going to class today because I am tired and my body is tired. I really am just like, I need to listen to that, right? It's not that I'm not going to go to it's your energy levels, right? It's kind of knowing and being in tune with your energy levels, and kind of knowing also to knowing, what do you have going on for the next day, right? Do I have a big workout that I have to do the next day, right? Or do I have some other like big life things that I need to do the next day? So maybe that yoga class in the evening isn't really the best idea, and maybe getting extra sleep is the better idea, right? Yeah, so it's looking at the whole big picture, is this a big weekend running for me, right? Am I doing like intense work? Maybe I shouldn't go to yoga class, right? Because like we said, it's not cross training, it's its own thing. And yes, there are benefits to it. But even though there are benefits to it, it can also take away from the running, right? So it really is looking at the big picture, right? And so if you do have a coach, maybe asking them like, hey, do you think I can fit in a couple of yoga classes this week? And hopefully that coach will be able to tell you like, sure, or maybe you fit it in on these days, or listen to yourself and, go for it. And then maybe, and if you don't have a running coach, or if you don't have somebody else that you can really talk to this about, it is really, you're going to have to trust yourself. And it really is looking at the big picture. And sometimes looking at the big picture is hard when you don't have a coach, because you're so in tune with just what's happening right then, which is great. Being in the present is great, right? Which is part of
Yeah.
yoga. But also knowing like, what are you have to do tomorrow? What do you have to do the next day? And is that really the best decision for today to set yourself up for the next day?
That is so perfect, because as I'm listening to you speak, I'm thinking of myself, right? So I spent 2 summers teaching a Monday night 8:30 p.m. class, and it was great. It was wonderful. I had a lot of fun teaching it, but after I taught it, I could not go to sleep. I was just so wired from having taught that my Tuesday morning run suffered from it. I got it done. I got it done because I'm disciplined enough or stubborn enough that I'll force myself out to do it. But I noticed the difference between when I wasn't teaching that class and when I was. That Tuesday run happened, it just felt so different. And even now, as I no longer teach that class, but I've decided after that, I'm like, I cannot teach evening classes because one, it just works me up in a way that does not allow me to go to bed at a decent time. And I also don't take evening classes for that reason, unless it is something like a yin class or something really, really slow. I don't take it because of that same reason, where I will take it and I'll feel great in the class. I'll feel great afterwards, but then I can't sleep. Or I just can't, like, I'm just too worked up. And instead of going to bed at 10 o'clock, which is usually my goal, I'm going to bed maybe more like 10:30, 11. And it may not seem like a lot, but when we're talking about waking up at 4:30 a.m., where that time to wake up cannot shift, any shifts in the night before, it is going to be felt. So I love that that's where the question led, of how do I tune into my body? It led into that, okay, let's kind of step back and let's assess, what do you have going on this week? When can you take that class? Because to your point, taking a 12 p.m. class is going to be really different in the body, and it's going to affect you differently than taking an 8:30 p.m. class. Taking just the style of class impacts that as well. So I'm just loving that, because I was like, here's an anecdote that I can share from my own personal experience of that 8:30 p.m. class. As a teacher was rough. As a student, it in a world where I didn't run the next day, it would be a really nice experience. But this is what I wanted to say. Ultimately, my priority is running. And anything else that I do has to be in service to the running. And I feel like that's what I'm hearing you say too, of if running is the thing that you're doing, yoga is that thing that you're adding, and it has to make sense with your energy levels, with where you are mentally, with where you are within a training cycle, within the weekly cycle, within whatever your day is.
100% yes. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's the same thing with myself. I won't take a yoga class past a certain time. I always go to the same time, because if I go later, I'm getting home later, I'm eating later. Then I don't want to go to bed right away because I just finished eating. Then I have to wait a little bit longer. It just sets my sleep all the way back. So no, I am very strict on my times that I will go to yoga, because if not, I'm not going to get that sleep, and that's going to impact me the next day. And that to me is just not worth it. Right. So, and if it doesn't fit in at that time, then I'm not going to class. Right. But like I said, if you are someone that needs to get in the practice, right, that's when you can go to the other things. You're going to meditate. You're going to do maybe the sun salutation at home for like 5 minutes. You'll get it in other ways, right? So yoga doesn't necessarily have to be defined just as going to class, which I think sometimes can be a misconception for people as well. It's like we said, it's so much bigger than that. But when we're talking specifically about going to a yoga class, yeah, definitely set boundaries to set yourself up so that it's not impacting your running.
Yeah. And just yes to all of that. All right. I asked you this question the last time you were on the podcast. I'm going to ask it again, see if anything's changed or if you have any new thoughts. But how can we make running more accessible and inclusive?
Yeah. You know what? I always think about this too, about with yoga as well, right? Because even though, like we were talking about, you don't have to go to yoga class to do yoga, it's nice to be able to go to a yoga class, right? But those cost money. They're not necessarily the cheapest things, right? And I think it just goes back to community and falling back into the community where you live, and going back to maybe it is creating a run group, it is joining a run group, right? It is trying out different run groups, right? Because maybe one group is too cliquey, or maybe one group you just don't feel as welcomed. And that's the same thing. It could be the same thing in a yoga studio. Like you said, yoga studios have different cultures, right? And it just all depends on where you're going to. So you want to make sure that wherever you're going, yoga studio or a run group, that is someplace that you feel comfortable, you feel like you can be yourself, you feel safe, and it feels welcoming. I think that's the number one thing, is that you want to feel welcome. You want to go. You want to run, right? So if it's something where you can't run because you live in an area that maybe isn't the safest, right? Then that's when you kind of have to seek out, maybe, okay, I'm going to find a run group or a partner to run with. So it does take some sort of effort to, do it. It just, it does, right? Yeah. I think it definitely is going back to the community.
Yeah, and it works the same with yoga, right? Like I love checking Eventbrite for whatever free yoga classes are happening. There's so many different special events with yoga classes. So it really is that community of finding someone to go with you, or finding the people that you do feel the safest with, or that you do feel the most welcomed. Ultimately, you want to feel like you belong in whatever it is that you're doing, because that feeling of belonging, that's just gonna add to longevity. That's gonna add to consistency. So, and it's, to me, I just love that you keep bringing it back to yoga, because for me, in my experience, there are so many parallels between yoga and running. And that's why those two have been things that have worked so well with each other for as long as it has for me, because running has been my constant, but yoga is always a second companion that I can return to whenever I want to. And it's because, at least for me, like that welcoming part, it's very much so like a welcoming myself back to myself through the yoga practice, coming home to myself there, and then being able to share that with others. So I really appreciate that, because through community, we can do so much. It's just so, so important. Final question. And again, I've asked you this again, but let's see what's changed for you. And it's just, where can we connect with you? And what do you have going on that we can celebrate you?
Yeah. So the most probably easy place to find me would be Instagram. And there I'm the Yogini_runner on Instagram. And I'm a running coach at Rising Mountains Coaching. And I think right now and this might sound kind of odd, but I think just the fact, and I really would hope, and this is where I want to see a lot of runners, you know, even ones that I work with and ones that I don't work with. I feel like with running, we do have those different seasons where things are going really good and we're feeling great and everything's clicking. And then when it's not, we have to reassess, and then things feel hard, and, you know, we're heartbroken, and we're kind of wondering, why do we do this anyways? And we, you know, we keep doing it, and coming to a place of just accepting who and where you are, and trusting that that's exactly the spot that you're supposed to be in your journey. And just because it's not exactly happening the way you want it to happen in that particular moment, or how you envisioned things to go, to keep on going, to not stop, to keep moving. I think if anything, moving, if there's anything that I can, like, if I try, is like, movement is life, whatever that looks like. And so I think the fact that I'm finally coming to terms with where I'm at right now in my running journey, and I'm really loving it, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. And I just hope for everyone to, you know, find acceptance within their story and where they're at.
I'm not going to say anything else. Just thank you. And everyone, we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.